Hi friends, welcome to Thai Mumbai's 211th webinar where we have created more than 450 hours of content to help the startup ecosystem. Please follow us on social media to be updated about the future events and past session videos. This is the 12th webinar for our special interest group, that is Thai Food Network. We have got some very interesting topics covered earlier and great speakers who have helped us address the current situations. Moving from current situations, we have also tried to get speakers spill their hacks and cheat codes on marketing, branding, and supply chains, etc. Today, we are excited to learn more on tips on scaling up and strategy, and also have candid conversation with two veterans of food and service industry. For this, I would like to call upon Sanket, who has been the lead for Thai Food Network. He has also been a food runner for over a decade now. After doing food at 2,000 plus events across 14 cities to selling 6 million plus period through food solutions in the B2B space. Now he, along with some stalwarts in the industry, is building a very interesting platform of verified spare capacity within the food industry to help cloud kitchen and packed food brands scale up across geography. He is also co-creating an aspirational food brand with a popular and a very famous celebrity chef in India around the concept of love stories of people through food. So Sankit, over to you.
Thank you, Trupti. Hello, everybody. So in the last couple of months, I've been speaking to a lot of people in the food and service industry, and some common words I've been hearing are turnaround strategies, the need to collaborate, stabilizing, scaling up. So I thought to answer these questions and elaborate more on these above mentioned hashtags, we've two terrific speakers with us today, veterans in their respective categories. Let me please welcome Rahul Pandit and Bansi Kutecha. Rahul is the MD and CEO of Hampstead Living, a rental housing JV of Lemon Tree Hotels and Warburg Trinkus. He was the founding member, president, and ED of Lemon Tree Hotels. He's instrumental in making Lemon Tree what it is today. He joined Ginger Hotels as MD and CEO and was responsible for its turnaround. Rahul also is a member of the National Tourism Committee. He's a IHM Pusa pass out, a former member of the Indian Karate team, and has also been featured on Hotelier India in its Power List 2017. Bansi has 15 plus years of professional experience. He began his career as a consultant with Accenture and Capgemini. After two unsuccessful attempts at starting up, he joined a legendary startup, Uber, as an early member of the Indian team and wore many leadership hats in his ride-sharing business, and finally was the head of Uber Eats across India and South Asia. I'll quickly move on to the Q&A. Rahul, if I may start with you, what has been noteworthy during your tenures at both Ginger Hotel and Lemon Tree is that along with customer satisfaction, both companies have scored very high on employee satisfaction. It is no mean feat for a hospitality company to be rated as one of the top employers. Would you want to throw some light on the significance of this?
Thank you, Sanket, and also Ty, for asking me to come on in and share some thoughts. See, in both the brands, we had an advantage of the vision. So at Lemon Tree, it was Patu Keswani, who I think has the ability to see ahead of the curve. And at Ginger, it was the Tata vision of creating great quality and value for money lodging solutions. When you say specifically around employee satisfaction, to me, the key thing has been that a great team is one which is aligned to a common purpose and it is fully empowered in business success, and it's supported similarly by an enabler like that. So to me, the components are in that sense quite simple. Do you have great team members who buy in to one common operating philosophy? Are they fully empowered and are they trusted? So if these high level ingredients are in place, I think then it's only a matter of discipline and perseverance for employee satisfaction to then form the bedrock of customer satisfaction.
Sure. So, Bansi, So you were one of the first employees of Uber in India. Uber is known to develop a market and cannibalize it in a good way. What were your strategies during your initial days to popularize Uber in India, both on the supply and demand side, considering Ola had already made a mark in India by then?
Thanks, Ankit and Ty. I hope I'm audible. Thanks for the question. So, yeah, I was one of the first few early members in the team at Uber. And I think for us, there were a couple of things at play. The Ola had already entered the market and was kind of solving the problem on the ground. The couple of things that went our way and the way we thought about increasing or kind of growing the business. One was there was a very clear product market fit. We understood, obviously, from the learnings in other countries that there is a very great gap between what the customers want and what the current services are providing. There's also a gap between what the drivers want and what the current regulations are providing. So we try to kind of make sure that we are focusing on both, right? For us, the customer was always the driver first and then the end consumer. So every or every decision that we made was always thinking from the fact that, hey, will this work for both the drivers and our end consumer? And it all started from the fact that we also called our drivers and driver partners. They were never our, employees or consultants or whatever you want to call it. They were always driver partners. That was ingrained as a philosophy in every single person at Uber. So from a strategy perspective, if I kind of take a step back and think through what all we did, like I said, we had a great product that worked really well, but it had to be Indianized. Our product was made for the Western world. It worked really well on an iPhone, but struggled on an Android. We didn't have cash. We had credit card that worked really well in the US, but in India, because of the 3-factor authentication protocol, it didn't work in India. So we had to kind of create hacks and create product changes so that it would fit in the Indian context for the consumer. So we launched with Paytm. We figured out a way to bring cash, which was a no-no from an Uber's philosophy perspective. Travis was very clear about, hey, we don't need cash. The idea, the entire experience becomes magical when you press a button, a car comes, you sit in the car, you go to your destination, and you walk out without opening your wallet. And for him, getting cash transaction in the whole place was a hindrance to that entire magical experience. So it took us a while to convince the leadership that cash is the king in a country like India. So we got cash in. On the driver side, a couple of things that worked for us was back in the day, we didn't have drivers to reach out to us using phone support, right? Basic, as simple as that. We were expecting our drivers to send us an email if there are any issues, or walk into one of our centers and solve their issues, right? So those things is where like the basic roadblocks that a consumer would face or a partner would face is where we focused our energies on to kind of solve for the market. And lastly, what was on the people side, which I think Rahul also touched upon. I think for us, getting the right kind of talent for every single role was very, very important. So, and it also went to the fact that we actually had to, like our hiring process was really slow. It took us anywhere between 6 to 10 interviews to get a candidate in. And then we got the right person in. It was always never looking back. So not proud of the process being slow, but very proud of the process being thorough in a way that we got the right candidate for the right role, irrespective of his past background, experience, college, anything of those sort, right? And then when he got the right people, it was all about empowering that person to be able to deliver on his or her OKRs and making sure that he has the right trust and tools to make it happen. So I think those couple of things kind of worked well for us, even though we were following after Ola launched in India.
Awesome. So, Rahul, you were one of the founding members of Lemon Tree Hotels. It is now counted as one of the most formidable brands in India. your tip for today's entrepreneurs on building a sustainable brand?
Okay. Sanket, I would say that if you look at any business or brand, it to me is effectively doing three things. First, is it synergistically creating value? Second is it enabling the contribution of all stakeholders? And third is it delivering sustainable returns? So if this underpinning is clear, then for an entrepreneur, it has to be, the person has to be sure that it actually calls for lots of personal discipline. Because while you can, get a framework for value, you will say that, hey, I'm going to enable stakeholder contribution, and yes, my business will deliver returns. And in personal discipline, what I mean is that there has to be acceptance of what it will take. The work-life integration will be of a different level. It will demand a commitment of a different type, and it will demand it daily. And it is not just the quality or quantity, it will be both. So it's like a relationship. It's a commitment which will thrive on how much do you put in yourself every day.
Sure.
Now, if we were to break down value and stakeholder contribution and sustainable returns, the first thing to me in creating value is that is there alignment of purpose to how the business is going to contribute to the greater good of the society. And in stakeholder contribution, the most important are the employees. So what kind of culture are we going to have in place? Because culture is like a magnet that attracts energy and it orients the direction of the business. So effectively, when I see the title CEO, to me, the title is effectively managing the energy of the place.
Wow.
So to me, the CEO is the chief energy officer, because that individual is responsible for how the culture would be shaped. Is it a culture that is going to recognize contribution? Is it something that will celebrate achievement? Will it encourage innovation? Are you going to place a premium on agility? Will you still be empowering when there is acceptance of failure? So if you do all of that, then there is a bedrock of trust which is created. And once that happens, something magical happens. That it leads to an expansion of the contribution of the talent which is in the company. And then people look forward to coming to work. Because an individual is saying that, hey, if I'm working at this place, I'm enjoying it. Because in many ways, I'm going up my own Maslow. Then work is not a chore. It's not something that you come to, make some earning out of it.
Sure.
That work in itself is so purposeful, it is so enabling that you feel you are growing with it. And once that happens, it's pure magic. And if the right culture is not there, then it's like a black hole, which will suck your energy. Then that's a place you will want to run away from.
Sure. Sure.
And when you look at returns, to me, it's again three very simple things. A, are you listening to customers? B, do we understand market forces? And C is, are we constantly working on processorizing the business for efficiency every day? And let me give you a very small example. And it still brings a smile to my face. I was at a point in time saying, how do we, make the cost, let's say, of our bathroom amenities better? So we had experimented, and we spoke to different brands. So I got this solution, which was a shampoo cum conditioner. And I was thrilled because, every press, which was 5 or 6 milliliters, I think we would have been saving like 30 paisa or something. And I thought it really worked. But as you can see, for me, it's very easy for stuff to work. So I'm there with this group of ladies and I was showing them this. And one of them turns around. And so I was describing to her very enthusiastically, this formulation. She said, Mr. Pandit, you are not the right candidate who would understand a shampoo and a conditioner. So let me explain it to you. So she said that, I still remember, she said shampoo has an exfoliating action and the conditioner is meant to seal it and provide volume. So when you bring both these contrasting properties together, she said, you may be technically right, but I'm not going to believe you. So if I stay at your property, I will still carry my own shampoo and my own conditioner. And I said, what she is saying makes immense sense. So the reason
Interesting.
I told you this is that even though this may be very small, and we may say that, hey, we are running a business, but at any point in time, if we do not really test the smallest assumption out and ratify it with the stakeholder, where it is going to impact. So whether it's a customer or if you are doing something, for the employees, or if you're looking at some metrics that you think may overall add shareholder value, but are shareholders in sync with it. If you're trying to be driving an initiative which may be societal, but hey, is there something that, a stakeholder, let's say the government, has an input on it? So it's actually, business is not rocket science in that sense. It's just doing 1,000 small things right. And the aggregated volume of those small 1,000 things is actually what gives business great momentum.
Very, very interesting. Very interesting. I'm going to take the liberty of using the energy in E from you, sir. For, uh, I you're currently creating Hampstead Living in India, and I read that you're following a Propco Opco model to build this brand. Could you elaborate more on this model, and is it a likely product of REIT?
Okay, let me first tell you what the big India opportunity is in 2 minutes. See, we have
Sure.
35 million kids who are in higher education, and one third of those, so 12 million kids, go from one city to another to study. And we have 850 universities in India and 43,000 colleges. The total lodging capacity of all these institutions is only 4 million beds. So 8 million kids every year are staying off campus. So they may be staying in PGs or, guest houses or, residences converted for this purpose. Similarly, if we just look at our key top 9 cities, there are another 35 million working professionals. And if you look like a city like Bangalore, 54% of Bangalore working professionals are migrants. You look at Bombay, it's 43%, Pune is 25%. Now the market obviously exists, but it's a very informal market. So the basics of the business, if I was to wear a hospitality hat, which is safety, security, cleanliness and hygiene, just these basics can be very big differentiators for this market. However, because there is no product which is existing in the market, B, the services envelope has not been defined. Therefore, for Hampstead, because what we are creating is actually going to be the benchmark model for the market, it was therefore important that we have an integrated Propco-Opco approach where we are not only developers and owners, but we are also operators. So we are very happy doing greenfield development, build to suit. We are happy taking over cold shells or warm shells and then converting and finishing them. We are also happy taking over existing assets, which may have different use and putting them, to operate whether student housing or co-living. And you are right. One monetization possibility is a REIT, could be a listing, but that's actually ahead in the future. Currently, the focus is to get the model out in the market, learn rapidly from what our consumers are going to tell us, and after that learning is in place, then quickly accelerate the growth across the country.
Sure. So someone from the audience had asked what a REIT is. So, I mean, just to add, a REIT is a real estate investment trust. And, yeah. So, Bansi, to moving on to you. So, what were your early strategies to launch Uber Eats in India, considering Zomato and Swiggy were obviously doing really well by the time you all decided to launch? And as a follow-on question, if I may add, why weren't existing Uber drivers doubled up as Uber Eats agents, at least with the popular restaurants, if not all? And what were the major roadblocks you all faced in scaling up Uber Eats beyond a point, if I may say?
All right. So there are a bunch of questions there. I'll try to kind of break it down and answer all of them, right? So back in the day, the thought was very clear. Our mission was making transportation as reliable as running water for everybody everywhere. And we are doubling down on how do we, no matter where you are in which city, globally, you press a button and a car comes to pick you up. And a lot of places we got that. No matter where you are, no matter what time of the day, 3 to 5 minutes, a car will be there to pick you up. And then we said, you know what, if we can move or get a car to you in 3 to 5 minutes, what all can we move? And that started off a thought around, hey, can we move couriers? Can we move food? Can we move something else? So Uber Eats started as an experiment in, I think it was Toronto, where we said we will try to move food. This was way before Swiggy, Zomato, or anybody else in India started food delivery. I think back in the day it was Tiny Owl. And we said, no, what, we'll try to move food because we can move people. We also used to do back in the day globally what we call as an Uber ice cream day. That is one day in a year, globally in every single city of Uber, which is about 500 plus cities. You could press a button, an ice cream van would show up, or ice cream would show up at the doorstep. And we were always experimenting here, like Rahul said, always kind of figure out what really works for a business. Like 1,000 things needs to kind of come together for a business to actually work, right? So our experiments are always on about, hey, how can we move and get food faster to people, leveraging the network that we had. What started as a small experiment in Toronto became Uber Eats and the Uber Eats app, and everywhere else before we launched Uber Eats in India. The existing cars were doubled down and shared for food delivery as well. So if I'm a Uber driver, I could opt in to be an Uber driver or an Uber Eats partner or both. And then what happens is, depending upon the time of the day and the day of the week and the supply situation and the demand, I might get a pickup of a person. And then after that, I might get a pickup of a parcel to be delivered to someone's house. So I am constantly utilizing the driver and the car and the vehicle across the two platforms. When we launched in India, I think this was 2017, if I remember correctly, that time, Swiggy, Zomato were already there, but they were in smaller markets. Swiggy was in 5 cities. Zomato was in multiple markets, but mostly on Discovery, and they were doing food delivery by a third party, which was, I think, the Roadrunner back in the day, or Runner it was called. So our entry strategy was pretty simple. We said we'll enter this market because we've got success in other Western countries. And the entry strategy was very, very clear, saying we already have the right penetration of customer. We will bring in the right restaurants and delivery couriers to be able to deliver food in the record time. To your question, why we didn't bring in the cars, I think the unit economics would make sense if I have a food being delivered, a car, right? So average basket size in India is about roughly between 300 to 500, depending upon where you go. Sure. Now, if it's a 300 rupees food parcel, and if I have a car delivering that, the unit economics just doesn't make sense. And to add to that, the parking woes of a driver, parking his car, picking up a parcel, going to a society, dropping the parcel, all of that would make a lot of operational difficulties. Plus, the driver would just not be excited about it, right? So the product market fit on the driver side or the car side didn't exist. And hence we brought in bikers or delivery partners, what we call them, to do the bike delivery. So that's the reason why none of the cars were used. They were used outside of India, but India, it just does not make sense. The economics would make sense. Thinking about what the strategy was on how we entered the market, So I think the thought was very, very clear, right? We were going after the premium segment of restaurants and customers. We were going, if I may take the liberty, we were going behind the cred audience, the audience which had the credit cards and the high-paying customers, and that's how we launched in Bombay with all the fanfare. But what we realized slowly is that there was a different market that actually demanded food delivery than the cred audience, and the use case was very different. And that's how we iterated. We started with Bombay with only premium restaurants, and then we moved to a Bangalore and a Delhi and a Hyderabad and a Chennai where the restaurant tiers kept on changing. And we realized, you know what, hey, we need to go down to tier two, tier three restaurants where the baskets further shrinks, but that's where the demand is. Um, so if you see subsequently, our launch strategies changed. We went to more tier two markets. I think we were the first ones to actually enter tier two markets, and then Swiggy and Zomato created a blitz growth strategy, and they launched in some 500 odd markets like crazy because they had the processes and the wherewithals. Um, but I think that the thought was we go premium, and then we quickly realized that the volume is in the mid tier markets or the mid tier restaurants, and we kind of bulldoze there. But I think Swiggy Zomato kind of they had a little bit more. I would say a product which was more suited to the Indian market than what we had, and that's how they came. So that's the overall way we kind of approached. And to your last question on why we couldn't scale beyond a certain limit, was just probably beyond that. I mean, for us, it was a global business, a global product. The Indian basket size was really too small for us to kind of change the product at a way India would want, right? I think there was a gap in what a product in India would look like, but a product works for a Western country. Simple things like cash or like a cash on delivery or credit cards with three-factor authentication. All of them were complexities in building a new product. And I think hence we had a ceiling up to what we could kind of grow. But then obviously we found the right strategic partner to kind of find the next avenue for us.
But I think you guys paved the path for tier 2 and tier 3 cities for Swiggy and Zomato, if I may, say, because I personally experienced the growth of Uber Eats in cities like Nasik and Indore, and I thought it was phenomenal the way you all entered there.
Yeah, you're right. I think the love we got in Nashik, Indore, Bhopal, all the other tier 2 markets that we went to was phenomenal. I still remember one of the restaurant partners in Indore called Johnny Hot Dog. The uncle, Mr. Vijay Rathod, he used to sell hot dogs for like 30 odd years. And his menu was literally three items. And by the time we entered Indore and over 6-7 months, Johnny Hot Dogs were the highest selling SKUs in Asia, if I remember correctly. I don't have the exact numbers, but if you go back and look up a couple of articles that Business Insider wrote about them, there was a History Channel episode that came out of for Johnny Hot Dog. It was phenomenal, like a small restaurant partner that has done all his life, made 3 items, 3 hot dogs. And his uncle still makes it with his own hands. Like, there's no machine and all. It's still handmade. It's beautiful. I mean, so the love that we got in tier 2 markets was amazing. Obviously, Swiggy Zomato did better to kind of capitalize that. But I think, honestly, I echo to everything that you hear in the news today, that tier 2, tier 3 markets is where there is the most growth is going to come out over the next few years and decades.
For sure. I agree that. So, Rahul, do you see assisted luxury co-living for younger nuclear families and senior citizens rising in India? I mean, on a lighter note, seeing the rising cases of divorces in India, it clearly shows the younger demography has commitment phobia, so to say. So does that make sense for the co-living businesses to thrive more eventually?
Well, Sanket, I am not privy to the separation figures that you are referring to. But the way that I see the younger generation and the evolution of the model See, firstly, to me, this generation is actually an Uber generation, if I could borrow that phrase, meaning that it's more OPEX driven than CAPEX driven. And this is also happening because India is urbanizing pretty fast. So 85 million Indians have moved to the cities over the last decade. So effectively, assume it's like Germany. One full Germany has come to India over the last decade, and we are such a large country that we seem to not be bothered about it. And along with that is the phenomena of nuclearization or small families coming together. And also this generation and these nuclear families are very mobile. So they will move cities, so somebody may start off, let's say in a or a Chennai, and after a couple of years, they move to, let's say, a Bangalore or a Hyderabad, and then let's say move to a Delhi or a Bombay before deciding where to settle in. Along with this is the entire issue of convenience and community. Because earlier, if value was money spent, today value is time saved. So if you put all these discrete phenomena together, first is people wanting to save time, i.e. the convenience. Second is because they are mobile, they do not want asset ownership at a young age because it will limit their mobility. So they are happy doing an OPEX versus a CAPEX. And third is finding a great community experience. So if you put all of this together, then the hypothesis is very clear that today, while there is great opportunity in student living and co-living, you are right, there is an equally great opportunity today for urban living, so solutions for young urban couples. And in India, similarly, senior living over the next 5 years to a decade would become a big opportunity. Firstly, there are some social taboos still around senior living. As those taboos start disappearing, along with that is better quality of life in communities. So both of these phenomena are definitely going to pick up. And globally, if you also see, tenanted living also for multi-generation families, also senior living, and at the top end, which is assisted living, which is with more medical facilities, that is the norm. Because effectively what you are paying is maintaining the quality of your lifestyle, getting a great community experience, and not being worried about safety, security, and hygiene, which just pure asset ownership does not accord.
Sure. Interesting. So, Mansi, so I think you are starting up again, and this time in the cloud kitchen space. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about your business idea? And if I may ask, so what learnings have you derived from your past startup stints and your celebrated journey with Uber, if I may ask?
Yeah, so I was just talking to you offline, right? I'm trying to start up again, trying to be third time lucky. The first two didn't work out well, but like they say, third time generally works out fine. That's how I play poker as well. So hoping to get the third one of the round, right? So the first two startups that I had, the first one was coincidentally so back in 2009 was a food delivery startup in Bombay called Hit the Spot. And for whatever reason, this was back in the day when I had come down from the US, and four of us started this startup. And back then it was just Meals on Wheels in Bombay, if people familiar in the community know. So we started this startup at this spot, and we got restaurants on board. But I think what we realized is that market was too young or too naive for that kind of space back then. And we just couldn't get any traction. The restaurants were not very keen to get on board. They're like, you know what, I already have my cycle boy who can actually go and deliver. I know my customers. The customers were not willing to experiment a lot. The whole seamless experience around apps or not, that was just phone calls. I think for multiple reasons, it didn't fly well. So we kind of shut shop. The second one I started was in 2014 with my wife. We started to do something around the child education and discovery phase. So even today, where I struggle with my two daughters is I don't know which school, which hobby class, or which institute is good for her. I think the biggest source of truth for me is my neighbors, my friends, my family who've had their kids go into these schools and idea classes and hobby classes and all that stuff, right? With EdTech boom, I think it's getting a little bit more tougher now because everything is online. So you really don't know which is good, right? So till today, there is not a single discovery platform which tells me, hey, this is good for your child. And this is the feedback that we've got from 10,000 different customers that we have. So we started this in 2014, and again, it seemed like we were a little early in the game. The parents were not willing to come on board and review what the childs did. The institutes were not very keen to get on a tech platform. And we kind of, we still tried to do it for a couple of years, but didn't get any traction, and we kind of found that out as well. But still today, that gap exists in the industry. What I'm doing now is piggybacking on whatever I've learned with Uber Eats and Uber in general and my two startups is trying to set up a managed cloud kitchen network, which basically provides a platform for any food brand to expand delivery reach exponentially. So when I say that, it does not mean that we're just giving out infrastructure for a brand to come and start. We're actually taking away the entire operating hurdle that a brand might face when they are expanding. So our model is where we will have not only the state-of-the-art kitchens, but we also have our trained manpower who will actually operate and cook and produce food for a particular brand. And then we'll partner with different aggregators, hyperlocal delivery, deliver it to the consumer. So if a brand coming out of Pune wants to set up a delivery network in Bombay, they don't need to find the real estate. They don't need to find manpower. They don't need to find integration with Swiggy, Zomato, or anybody else. They just partner with us and we do everything for them. And in a month's time, the brand is live across channels. So trying to set that up and trying to make sure first box check is we are not early in the game. Actually, it's the perfect time. The industry is going through a great revolution and a step change in how F&B will be delivered to the masses in the future, starting with COVID. Everything that I've learned about hypergrowth, everything I learned about people and culture at Uber, everything that, what Rahul talked about, how people and culture kind of make the whole business come together, is what I'm kind of piggybacking on and working with different partners and my team to get this platform to live. And hopefully if things go well, we should be live in Bombay in about 4 weeks.
Awesome. All the best for that. I think if Byju's is listening to whatever you just said, they might, after White Hat Junior, want to buy off your EdTech startup that you started in 2014. I think it's a brilliant idea, whatever you said about that discovery thing. So, yeah. So, Rahul, you are also a member of the Tourism Committee of India. What suggestions do you have to make tourism within India glamorous, affordable, hygienic, and popular? Most Indians end up going, abroad for a vacation. But I mean, there's so much in India, but we don't explore India as much.
See, actually, India is a very big domestic market. And last year we had 1.8 billion domestic trips inside. When we look at Indians going out, essentially flying out, versus international travelers coming in, there you are right. Because while 22 million Indians last year flew out, we got only about 10 million outbound. So effectively for one person coming in, 2 Indians are going out. So one big silver lining for the country is going to be that courtesy COVID, the 22 million trips, they would get consumed within the country. But what to do to make, actually, see, tourism in India could also be, besides it being hygienic and popular, it also has the potential to be a very big driver of jobs. And currently also, about 9% of total jobs in India and the similar percentage of the GDP is supported by tourism. However, tourism sits in the state list in our constitution. It's actually high time for it to be moved to the concurrent list so that there is one national common focus on driving tourism for the country. Along with that, there have been one or two other agenda items that I've shared with different stakeholders. First is to get tourism and hospitality infrastructure status. Because currently without that, debt is in double digits and repayment is in single digit years. And this is effectively a long gestation business. And with this sort of debt funding, businesses risk becoming NPAs even before they become profitable. Another big thing for the country is to co-opt tourism into its education syllabus. So like we teach other subjects for appreciation of our national heritage and for seeing how do we convert tourism into an economic policy item, at a very young age, kids have to be experienced firsthand the geography, the pride, the history of our country. So in states, it could mean that we identify a tourism circuit where kids are actually taken to. So if you are in Maharashtra, you need to know how was it that there was actually a very formidable navy led by Kanuji Angre, which held off the Britishers. Similarly, if you are taking a lesson in history, you need to actually take kids, if you are in Delhi, to the Red Fort. So all states need to have a syllabi like that, and at a national level, a national syllabus where kids will actually move and experience our current modern temples of India. The modern temples could example be Sabarmati, it could be Sri Harikota, where we do our rocket launches. It could be Indian Parliament. It could be the Vallabhbhai statue. So what happens with that is that we are also then going to create a cadre of people who will be local tourism guides and teachers. So that's sustainable for the economy. And with this sense of consciousness and hygiene overall in India, because now it is time for India to move itself to delivering services jobs. So this consciousness and this focus will not only help hospitality, but it will help India's integration and also focus on services. So co-opting tourism into education, this is going to be a very big plank for the country to move forward and also generate huge jobs.
I think that's a very interesting thought. The tourism will rise if the history changes. I mean, I think our history needs to become more interesting, and the kids need to take more pride in what India is. So, Bansi, your take on the future of the restaurant industry, the prevalent delivery commission rates, if I may touch upon, and how big a role will cloud kitchen play in the resurrection of the industry?
Sure, I'll try to address that first. So I think, I think aggregator commission is something that's been a challenge across the board. I'm assuming.
Bansi, I think your voice is lagging in between. If you may want to shut your video and put it on again. Bansi, are you there?
I think it's an issue with Bansi's side. Can we move to the next question?
Sure. So Rahul, in the meanwhile, if I may ask you,
Sure.
what suggestions do you have for the hospitality and service industry to not only survive in these times, but to come out stronger in these times?
Thank you, Sanket. That's a very pertinent question for today's time. So the first is that the industry has to focus on the domestic market because it has big sustenance potential. The second is we have to in the industry look at reducing our fixed costs or variabilizing them. And this is actually a wake up call to reorient our financial models. And then this time is also going to ensure that the industry starts disaggregating an integrated business model. Because today, one is that the business, many brands are hugely subscale. And this entire business has different competencies in it. So there is real estate, there is management of services, management of costs, there is revenue management, there is distribution with its subsets of loyalty, internet, and proprietary marketing. So the ownership of all these subsets, instead of being integrated, will effectively become co-opted or will become very discrete. And then the industry has to also be ready for consolidation so that brands can really enjoy the benefits of scale.
Sure. To further ask you on that, so do you think in the hospitality industry, you will probably see a lot of collaborations in the hotels, co-workings and co-livings? You think these three components of the hospitality and service industry will coexist in the near future?
See, yes, actually, all businesses which rely on real estate, they will have to redraw their return scenarios because if earlier, let's say commercial was delivering X, let's say in India, if it was 8 or 9%, and if residential on the other hand was 1.5 and 2, the return profiles of all these underlying real estate land parcels, they are going to change. And with this change will also come on in to say how much cash can you generate actually. And what do you need to be running all these models? So in many places, it may be that if there is an integrated smart campus, which is co-working, co-living and hospitality together, that may be the answer. In other places, it may be that, if you have huge office clusters, then a big integrated co-living development may be the answer. If there are universities and for them to be focused on education rather than housing may be the answer. This means that the universities actually take off their residential part of their books and it's in a separate on a separate balance sheet of somebody who's actually running that business. So all these models will emerge because the underlying returns profile of all the sectors is going to change. And with COVID already, there is huge yield compression, which is now going to be coming into the market. And another big realization will be that great scale is actually going to be a big moat against dilution of margins.
Sure. Just taking a question from the audience. So, how much importance do you think is IoT, automation, and AI going to play in both the service and the food industry?
See, IoT, automation, tech, all of these were already important components. Now with COVID, their impact is going to be accelerated on two counts. First is to say that the investment in capital in technology, what benefit or what arbitrage will it give in OPEX? Second is with COVID, there is greater consciousness of the adoption of technology.
Sure.
So there will be many more people who are looking at delivering these solutions, and also the cost of these technologies and adoption, this will go down. And one big thing has been customers' acceptance of different tech solutions. So with COVID, I think, it's falling into a very interesting place because customers have gotten more receptive to tech. The costs of tech are falling down, and long-term investments in tech today would effectively prove to be long-term arbitrage in reducing costs. So I think overall, probably it will be a 5x jump in tech adoption in different businesses. Due to COVID, what would have been otherwise?
Sure. Bansi, I think, are you back?
Yes, I'm back. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Sorry about that.
No problem. You want me to repeat the question, or you?
No, I got the question. I'll try to answer that.
Sure.
So there were three things that you asked. One was about the restaurant industry as such, how things will shape up, how things should shape up, cloud kitchen point, and the third was aggregation commission, right? So I think on the aggregator commission, a lot has been already said, and a lot of folks are working to figure out alternate means of reaching the customer. I think one thing that's coming out really well and clearly across every industry, not just F&B, is how do we figure out a way to own our own customer information, and how do we directly talk to our customers, which unfortunately is not possible with aggregators as of today. So I know a lot of folks and a lot of startups are working in that space. So I'll hope we'll get the right answer with all these innovations that's coming in place, right? On the restaurant side, I think COVID should lead to a step change in how consumers interact with restaurants. It's already started, and whenever the restaurants open up, it's going to have a very profound impact on how the overall industry works. Not just about how consumers come in and eat at the restaurant, but also how the restaurants operate. I mean, I would love to go out and eat my favorite restaurants, but I don't know if that restaurant owner, how will he manage his books with half the tables or half the crowd because of social distancing and all the rules and regulations that come with COVID. So I think those are basic questions that we don't have answers to. And that'll require the industry to innovate, and maybe IoT or the automation play a role in that. I don't know, but I think what I personally believe is the industry that has been running for so long in a certain way will see a step change, and things will move to a different world altogether. Cloud kitchen or the delivery kitchen will play a very massive role in this step change. Not because what I'm doing, but in general. Currently, for example, the person who's curating or creating food, the chef in the restaurant, doesn't necessarily own the restaurant. There's a restaurant owner, and then there's a chef who's a partner. With COVID and the cloud kitchen and the fact that anybody can cook food and deliver remotely, you will see chefs actually creating their own restaurants already happening now, or delivery kitchens already happening now, but it'll happen more profound. You will see people which has spare capacity tying up with these chefs to create cloud kitchens. And you will see people like me who have a staff, a spare capacity, and operational know-how work with chefs to create cloud kitchen brands. So in my head, the entire F&B industry will witness some sort of a step change in the course of time. I as much as I'd like to, I don't see the restaurants going back to the normal way of working, what it was pre-COVID. I'm just not talking about numbers. I'm just talking about the operational way of working, hanging out outside, waiting in the line to get in the restaurant, sitting in an overcrowded restaurant. I think all of those things are going to be a thing of the past, because people are used to now eating at home, ordering in, watching their favorite OTT shows, being part of the family dinners and stuff like that. So I think all of that will play a role in how people consume food or beverages going forward. And if you're doing something for 6 months, it's high probability it becomes a habit.
Makes sense. So I think Rahul and Mansi, you guys were terrific. I think you guys have given us some amazing tips to kind of fight back post this COVID. I see some people in the audience still raving about the conditioner example that you gave, Rahul, and I think your idea of making the history glamorous to make tourism glamorous eventually was brilliant. Bansi, your tips from the Uber story and your own story were outstanding. with this, I will hand it back to Trupti and Naveen to to take it ahead for us.
Thank you, Rahul, and thank you, Rahul, and thank you, Bansi. It was a very interesting insight in the industry. And I see Naveen also here. Naveen, in case if you would want to speak up.
Again, thanks a lot. It was a lovely session. For me, at least, a lot to think about in terms of operations of both hospitality and running a thing like Uber Eats and delivery. It was great insights. Please feel free to kind of take the help of TiE across chapters everywhere. We love to kind of pass on our help to all entrepreneurs, and also entrepreneurs on this forum. If you think you can kind of partner with both of them, with either Rahul or Bansi, please write to us. We'll be more than happy to kind of connect you all. I think both of them are looking at spare capacities. If any of you entrepreneurs have either in terms of kitchen or in terms of living space, which they can kind of come to you, and let's use this as a platform to, increase business on both the ends. And to you both, thank you very much. We will not let you both go so easily. We will come back to you guys within a fortnight to sit and pick your brains on many more issues. Thanks a ton. This is really useful.